The courtroom was eerily silent. The judge's gavel slammed down with finality, sealing Michael Carter's fate. Guilty. A decorated officer with 15 years of service, Michael sat in handcuffs, staring at the floor, his repeated claims of innocence ignored. He knew the evidence had been planted, but it hadn't mattered. The verdict was devastating, but the real pain came from knowing he'd be separated from Luke, his loyal canine partner. Near the back of the courtroom, Luke sat alert, his sharp gaze locked onto Michael. Luke wasn't just a partner, he was family. Through every life or death moment, he had been by Michael's side. Now, as Michael faced his darkest hour, the thought of never seeing Luke again was unbearable. The judge rose to leave, but Michael's voice cut through the heavy silence. "Your Honor," he said, his voice unsteady. "Before I'm taken away, I have one request. Please let me say goodbye to Luke." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge hesitated, studying Michael carefully before finally giving a curt nod. 3 minutes. The moment Luke was released, he sprinted across the room, his claws clicking against the floor. Michael dropped to his knees, pulling Luke into a desperate embrace. "I'm so sorry, buddy," he whispered, tears slipping down his face. "I let you down. I won't be there anymore." Luke whimpered, nuzzling into Michael's chest. Then suddenly he tensed. The German Shepherd's nose worked frantically. Against Michael's jacket, he tugged at the fabric, barking sharply. The unexpected sound shattered the stillness of the courtroom. The judge frowned. "What's the dog doing?" Luke pulled harder, his sharp barks growing more insistent. An officer cautiously approached, patting Michael's jacket. The room held its breath. Then, with a metallic clink, something small hit the floor, a recording device. The prosecutor's face went pale. The courtroom buzzed with shock. The prosecutor stepped forward quickly, his voice tight. "This doesn't prove anything," he snapped. But Luke barked again, standing firm. The truth was undeniable. Whatever was on that device mattered. Michael stared at the recorder, his heart pounding. Could this be the proof he had been waiting for? The tension in the room thickened as every eye locked onto the device. It lay there, glinting under the fluorescent lights. Luke stood beside Michael, rigid, his piercing gaze demanding attention. "Pick it up," the judge ordered. An officer hesitated before bending down and lifting the recorder for all to see. His confusion was evident. "What is this?" the judge demanded, his sharp gaze shifting to the prosecutor who had begun to sweat. The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant," he stammered. "It wasn't submitted as evidence. Clearly it's been tampered with." "Tampered with?" The judge cut in, his tone razor sharp. "In a courtroom, during sentencing?" His words sliced through the room, making the prosecutor visibly flinch. "Officer, activate the device." The officer fumbled, his fingers trembling as he pressed play. Static crackled, followed by muffled voices. The room leaned in. Then the words came through, loud and clear. "Just plant the evidence. No one's going to question it." Michael's breath caught. The voice was unmistakable. Carter's clean record makes him the perfect scapegoat. "Get it done." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Michael's stomach twisted as recognition slammed into him. That voice belonged to his former supervisor, Captain Ray Harding. "That's enough," the prosecutor blurted, stepping forward. But the judge slammed his gavel down hard. "Sit down," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. The prosecutor froze mid-step. Michael's mind reeled. The recording exposed everything, how he had been framed, how the evidence had been planted. Luke, still at his side, let out a low, rumbling growl, mirroring his partner's silent fury. 3. Judge leaned back, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke. "This trial is not over." He turned to the officers. "Escort the defendant back to holding. That device is now new evidence. This case is being reopened." For the first time in weeks, a flicker of hope sparked in Michael's chest. As he was led away, he turned for one last look at Luke. The dog's intelligent eyes were filled with unwavering loyalty. Michael silently made a promise, to himself and to Luke. He would not let this injustice stand. back in the cold holding cell. He sat on the hard bench, staring at the blank wall, his mind racing. Luke's instincts had uncovered what no one else had, a truth that could change everything. That recorder was his lifeline. But beyond the relief, there was something else, a deep, searing betrayal. Captain Ray Harding, the man he had trusted for years, had been behind it all. Michael clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. How deep did this go? Meanwhile, inside the judge's chambers, tension ran high. The judge sat at his desk, replaying the recording on a secure device. The voices were unmistakable. Captain Harding's commanding tone, paired with another voice Michael didn't recognize, revealed a calculated conspiracy. The judge's eyes narrowed. He pressed a button on his intercom. "Summon Captain Harding to my office immediately," he said curtly. Outside the courtroom, Harding had been waiting, ensuring Michael's sentencing went as planned. But when an officer approached with the judge's summons, a flicker of unease crossed his face. He rose stiffly, adjusting his tie, and followed the officer down the hall. Inside the chambers, the judge's expression was unreadable as Harding entered. The captain offered a polite nod, but his shoulders were tense. "You called for me, Your Honor?" Harding asked, his voice steady, though his eyes flicked nervously toward the recorder on the desk. "I did," the judge replied, leaning forward. He tapped the recorder with his finger. "Care to explain this?" Harding's confidence faltered, just for a second, before he masked it with confusion. "I'm not sure what you mean, Your Honor," he said evenly. The judge pressed play. Once again, the damning words filled the room. Harding's face paled, but he quickly forced a chuckle. "Your Honor, this is absurd," he said, shaking his head. "That could be anyone. You can't seriously think—" "I don't think." The judge interrupted, his voice sharp. "I act on evidence, and this—" He gestured to the recorder. "This is evidence of a crime. Multiple crimes." The door opened. 2 officers stepped inside. Harding stiffened. Panic flickered in his eyes as they approached. "What are you doing?" Harding demanded, his voice rising. "You can't—" "You're being detained for questioning," the judge said firmly. "Until we get to the bottom of this, you are a suspect in obstruction of justice and falsifying evidence." The officers seized Harding's arms. He struggled as they led him away, his protests echoing down the corridor. The judge leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. The web of corruption was unraveling, and fast. Michael Carter's story was far from over. The recording's discovery sent shockwaves through the department. Harding's arrest fueled whispers of corruption, spreading like wildfire. But in his holding cell, Michael remained unaware of the chaos unfolding outside. His thoughts lingered on Luke. The loyal K9 had uncovered the recorder. What else could he find? Meanwhile, Luke had been taken to the department's K9 unit for evaluation. Officer Sarah Mitchell, one of Michael's closest colleagues, had volunteered to look after him. She watched as he paced his kennel, his sharp barks echoing through the quiet building. "He knows something's wrong," Sarah murmured, crouching near the bars. She met Luke's eyes. "Don't worry, buddy, we'll figure this out." As she stood, Luke pressed his nose against the gate, sniffing intently at her jacket. Sarah frowned. Was this connected to Michael's case? Or was she imagining things? After a beat, she made a decision. She unlatched the kennel. "All right, boy," she said, grabbing his leash. "Let's see if you're trying to tell us something." She led Luke to the department storage room, stopping in front of Michael's locker. The dog immediately began sniffing and pawing at the lower compartment. Sarah's pulse quickened as she unlocked it and swung the door open. Inside, beneath a few neatly folded uniforms, lay a small, unmarked envelope. Her hands trembled as she pulled it out. Peeling it open, she found photographs, grainy but unmistakable. They showed Captain Harding meeting with a known criminal. Behind the photos was a document, transaction records detailing a bribery scheme, directly linked to the case that had put Michael behind bars. Sarah's chest tightened as the weight of the discovery settled over her. Luke sat beside her, his tail still, his keen eyes locked onto hers. She whispered, her voice breaking. You just blew this whole case wide open. Sarah had found the smoking gun. Realizing the magnitude of what she held, she immediately contacted the judge's office. The photos and documents combined with the recording Luke had uncovered painted a damning picture of Harding's guilt. But Sarah knew this wasn't over. If Harding had orchestrated this setup, he likely hadn't done it alone. Luke sat beside her, his steady presence grounding her as her mind raced. Michael was right, she murmured, scratching behind Luke's ears. You really are the best partner anyone could ask for. Sitting in the evidence room, Sarah spread the incriminating photos across the desk. The weight of her discovery pressed heavily on her chest. Harding wasn't just a corrupt officer, he was part of something much larger. The documents Luke had helped uncover revealed connections to other high-ranking officials, unexplained payments, and a chilling trail of manipulation that stretched far beyond Michael's case. She glanced down at Luke, who remained alert beside her. His piercing eyes seemed to sense her unease. This isn't just about Michael, she muttered. This goes way deeper. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Sarah called the judge directly. Within an hour, the evidence was in his hands. As he flipped through the documents, his expression darkened. This is bigger than I thought, he admitted. If these documents are accurate, Michael Carter isn't just innocent. He's a victim of a department-wide cover-up. The judge wasted no time. He immediately ordered an emergency hearing. News of the case reopening sent shockwaves through the precinct. Officers whispered in hallways, tensions rising as suspicions grew. Several officers who had testified against Michael began to squirm, knowing their involvement might soon be exposed. Back in his cell, Michael was called out unexpectedly. The sudden commotion in the jail's holding area made his pulse quicken. He was escorted to a secure room where Sarah and the judge were waiting. As soon as he saw the folder of evidence and Luke sitting proudly by Sarah's side, his heart swelled with a mixture of hope and disbelief. This just came in, the judge said, sliding the documents toward him. It proves Harding's corruption. Most importantly, it proves the evidence used to convict you was fabricated. Michael's hands trembled as he flipped through the papers. The photos, the records, even notes detailing how Harding had manipulated the case against him. It was all there. His voice cracked. Does this mean? The judge nodded firmly. It means you're going free, but this isn't over yet. There are more people involved, and we're going to need your help to expose them. Michael knelt down, pulling Luke into another embrace. You saved me, boy, he whispered. You saved me again. Luke wagged his tail, and for the first time in weeks, Michael felt the weight on his chest begin to lift. But he knew this was just the beginning. Whoever had orchestrated this went deeper than Harding. There were more layers to uncover, and Michael wouldn't rest until the full truth was brought to light. What do you think will happen next? Will Michael uncover the full conspiracy? Share your thoughts in the comments. Michael stepped out of the courthouse, a free man for the first time since his arrest, but the weight of what lay ahead was far heavier than the shackles he had just shed. Reporters swarmed the steps, shouting questions about his release, the reopened case, and the corruption scandal brewing within the department. Michael ignored them. His focus was on Luke, who trotted faithfully at his side. Seeing his loyal K-9 partner brought a flicker of hope amid the chaos. Inside the courthouse, the judge had convened a special task force to investigate the growing web of corruption. Sarah, now an integral part of the team, was leading the charge. The photos, recordings, and financial records Luke had helped uncover pointed to a sprawling network of bribery and evidence tampering. Multiple officers and even external players were involved. Harding was just the tip of the iceberg. Michael, Sarah called, catching up to him outside the courthouse. We need your help. No one knows this department better than you. Michael hesitated, his jaw tightening. He had spent his entire career believing in the integrity of the badge. Now that trust was shattered. But then he looked down at Luke. The dog's calm, determined eyes reminded him why he had joined the force in the first place. I'm in, he finally said. But I'm not doing this for the department. I'm doing it for the truth and for every officer who's still fighting for what's right. The real battle was just beginning. Together they cross-referenced timelines, dug through case files, and interviewed officers who had worked closely with Harding. Some were willing to cooperate, but others stonewalled, raising even more suspicions. Luke played a surprising role, sniffing out hidden files and leading them to overlooked evidence during searches of Harding's office and locker. One night, while sifting through a pile of old case files, Sarah discovered a list of names, officers, local politicians, and known criminals, all linked to suspicious payments and unsolved crimes. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous the trail became. This wasn't just about Michael's case. It was about an entire network of people who had used their power to cover up crimes and destroy anyone who stood in their way. Michael looked up from the file he was studying as Sarah's voice filled the tense silence. "If we push this any further, we're going to make enemies. Dangerous ones." Michael's jaw tightened. "We've already made them, but I'm not stopping, not until the whole truth comes out." Luke let out a soft bark, as if in agreement. Michael reached down to scratch the dog behind the ears, his resolve hardening. They weren't just fighting for justice anymore. They were fighting for everyone who had been silenced, betrayed, or framed. The task force worked around the clock. Boxes of evidence filled every available desk in the small conference room that had become their headquarters. Michael, now officially cleared of all charges, threw himself into the investigation. The more they uncovered, the more twisted the web of corruption became. Bank statements, falsified police reports, and intercepted communications all pointed to a massive conspiracy that extended far beyond Captain Harding. Sarah placed a thick folder in front of Michael, her expression grim. "We've identified at least 6 other officers who were in on this," she said. "Some of them are high-ranking, and it gets worse. There's evidence tying them to organized crime." Michael leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. These weren't just rogue officers bending the rules for personal gain. This was an orchestrated operation, corruption embedded in the department, intertwined with powerful criminal enterprises. "If this is as big as it looks, we can't handle this alone," he said. "We need to take this federal." But Sarah shook her head. "Not yet. We're still missing key pieces. If we take this to the FBI now and they leak it, the whole operation could scatter. We need something definitive, something that locks these people in place." Their conversation was interrupted by Luke, who suddenly stood up, ears perked. He sniffed the air and trotted toward the far side of the room, where a stack of old case files sat in disarray. Michael frowned. "What is it, boy?" Luke pawed at one particular box. Michael and Sarah exchanged a glance before opening it. Inside were files from a drug bust 5 years ago, a case that had supposedly resulted in a clean sweep of arrests. As Michael flipped through the documents, his pulse quickened. The details didn't add up. Names had been erased, sections of reports were blacked out, not standard redactions, but something more deliberate. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. Sarah leaned over his shoulder. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a handwritten note at the bottom of one report. It was a signature, Captain Harding's. The drug bust had been a cover-up. The evidence suggested that the operation had been a smokescreen, eliminating rivals in the drug trade while shielding criminals who were paying off the department. Michael clenched his fists. "They were playing both sides," he said, anger lacing his voice. "And they ruined good officers' lives to do it." As they continued sifting through the files, Michael's phone buzzed. He glanced down at the screen, a text from an anonymous number. "You're digging too deep. Stop, or you'll regret it." His chest tightened. This wasn't just intimidation. It was a direct threat. He showed the message to Sarah. Her face paled, but her voice was steady. "This isn't random. They know exactly what we're working on." Michael exhaled sharply, looking down at Luke. The dog sat calmly by his side, as if ready for whatever came next. "Let them come," Michael said. "We're not stopping. Now." The room was heavy with tension as the rest of the team left for the night. Michael and Sarah stayed behind, determined to uncover the missing piece of the puzzle. Luke lay by Michael's feet, his ear occasionally twitching as he rested. "We're close, but we're still missing the key," Sarah murmured, sifting through the files. She pointed to a document Michael hadn't noticed before. "Look at this. Every major bribe and erased report ties back to one name. AR. Michael's eyes narrowed. AR, he muttered. They've stayed hidden this long, but if we find them, this whole operation crumbles. Suddenly Luke stood up, his body tense, his ears flicked forward, and he let out a low growl. Michael looked down at him, alarmed. "What is it, boy?" Before Sarah could respond, the lights in the conference room flickered, then went out completely. The room plunged into darkness. Sarah's breath hitched as her hand instinctively reached for her weapon. "That's not a power outage," she whispered. 22. The sharp sound of breaking glass shattered the silence, followed by heavy, deliberate footsteps just outside the door. Michael's heart pounded as adrenaline surged through his veins. He motioned for Sarah to take cover. "We're not alone," he whispered. Luke crouched low, his growl deepening. His sharp eyes locked onto the door. Whoever had sent that threatening text wasn't bluffing. The footsteps grew louder. Michael gripped his weapon tightly. His mind raced through the possibilities. "Stay close, Luke," he whispered. Sarah locked eyes with him, her expression resolute. "Whatever happens," she said, "we don't let them win." The door creaked open, then burst wide as a shadowed figure stepped into the room, weapon drawn. Luke lunged, moving with incredible speed. His jaws clamped onto the intruder's arm. The man let out a guttural scream, dropping his weapon as he struggled to shake the dog off. Michael didn't hesitate. He kicked the gun away and trained his weapon on a second figure now rushing through the doorway. "Don't move," Michael barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. The second intruder froze, hands raised, but there was tension in their stance. They were waiting for an opportunity. Behind him, Sarah had taken cover, her voice steady but urgent as she called for backup. Luke held firm, growling low as the first man struggled. "Call him off!" the man yelled, panic creeping into his voice. Michael stepped forward, his gun steady. "Call them off first," he shot back, motioning toward the hallway. More footsteps echoed outside. Heavy, deliberate. Whoever these people were, they hadn't come to negotiate. The man refused to answer. Then, a deafening sound, tear gas canisters, burst into the room. Thick, acrid smoke filled the air, stinging their eyes and throats. "We're out of time," Sarah coughed, grabbing the files. "We need to move." Michael whistled sharply. Luke immediately released his grip on the man's arm, retreating to his side. They moved fast, ducking low, pushing toward the emergency exit. Gunfire erupted behind them. Bullets pinged off walls and furniture. Michael's pulse pounded in his ears as he covered Sarah and Luke, firing back to slow their pursuers. Bursting through the exit, they stumbled into a dark alley behind the building. Sarah clutched the files to her chest, gasping for air. "We can't go back to the precinct," she said between breaths. "They've compromised everything. They'll be waiting for us." Michael nodded, his mind racing. Whoever AR was, they were playing for keeps. But as he looked down at Luke, panting, but unshaken, Michael felt a surge of resolve. "Then we finish this on our terms," he said. "We're not running anymore." The safe house. The cabin was eerily quiet. Hidden deep in the woods, it was their last refuge. Michael, Sarah, and Luke had retreated there after narrowly escaping the attack. Spread across the wooden table were the files Sarah had managed to save. Transaction records, names, ties to AR, the dice, shadowy figure who had orchestrated everything. Sarah flipped through the pages, her fingers trembling. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice firm. "If we get this to the press or federal investigators, they won't be able to bury it. The whole operation will collapse." Michael nodded but kept his eyes on the window, scanning the tree line. He knew this wasn't over. The people they were up against wouldn't back down. They would do whatever it took to silence them. Suddenly, Luke's ears pricked up. A low growl rumbled in his chest as his body tensed. Michael went still, his fingers drifting toward his weapon. They found us, he whispered. Sarah's face paled, but her jaw tightened. How? We've been careful. Michael shook his head. It doesn't matter. They're here. The first gunshot shattered the silence. Glass exploded from the two cabin window, spraying across the room as Michael yanked Sarah down behind the table. Luke barked, his stance rigid, ready to protect them. More shots rang out. The attackers were closing in. Michael took a deep breath, adrenaline rushing through his veins. Stay down, he ordered. Luke and I will hold them off. As the front door burst open, he and Luke moved as one. Michael fired, dropping the first intruder. Luke lunged at another, knocking him down, teeth sinking into fabric and flesh. But the assault didn't stop. Sarah crawled toward the files, frantically stuffing the most crucial documents into a bag. Michael, she shouted over the gunfire. We need to get these out of here now. Michael's face was grim. Go. Luke and I will cover you. She hesitated, her eyes flicking between him and the chaos outside. Then, clutching the files, she slipped out the back door, disappearing into the night. Michael and Luke held their ground, pushing back the attackers with everything they had. Just as the last intruder fell, sirens howled in the distance. Backup, finally. Days. Later, the story broke nationwide. Sarah had delivered the files to a trusted journalist, and the resulting exposé shattered the corrupt network. Arrests followed. Corrupt officers, politicians, and, at the center of it all, AR himself, a powerful figure who had manipulated the police department for his own gain. Michael was hailed as a hero, though he didn't care for the spotlight. Standing on his porch, he watched Luke play in the yard, the loyal dog who had saved him more times than he could count. Their bond was unbreakable. We did it, boy, Michael murmured, kneeling to scratch behind Luke's ears. It's over. Luke wagged his tail, leaning into Michael's touch, his sharp eyes finally at peace. For Michael, this wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the start of something new. He hadn't just fought for himself. He had fought for the silenced, the betrayed, the ones who never got justice. As he watched Luke chase a ball through the golden glow of the setting sun, he knew they had earned this moment of peace.